I need backup. Now! I've got an assault suspect!
You came after me. You all came after me.
Unit inbound, hold position. Stay with me.
See him.
Don't move!
The static on the police radio is usually just background noise, but today, it carried the sound of a nightmare. In the middle of a quiet morning, the voice of Officer Julian Merrick broke through, high and tight with a kind of fear that stops your heart. "I need help," he gasped, his words nearly drowned out by the sound of a violent struggle and heavy, uneven breathing. There was no location given, no description of the suspect, just the raw sound of a man fighting for his life in the grass. By the time backup arrived, the scene looked like a horror movie. Officer Hageman sprinted toward the white police car, his own breath coming in ragged bursts. "Sorry, man. I'm sorry I couldn't get here any faster," he shouted as he saw Merrick on the ground, bleeding badly from his head. Over him stood a man in a bright purple wig, his face twisted into a snarl, still holding a stolen taser. The peaceful park had turned into a kill zone in less than 10 minutes. "Let's get this mother out of here," Hageman yelled as he moved to tackle the suspect and save his partner. Merrick lay there, his eyes already starting to swell shut, unable to even see the friend who had finally come to help him. He had gone from a routine call to a desperate battle, and as the sirens grew louder in the distance, the only question was how a report about a strange man in a wig could lead to an officer almost losing his eyes. It all started on a Saturday morning at Sawyer Point, a popular spot where people go to play pickleball and enjoy the fresh air. The sun was out, and the courts were busy with players when a strange man appeared. He wasn't there to play. Instead, he stood by the fence, watching the players with an intensity that made everyone feel unsafe. He was hard to miss, wearing a bright red hoodie and a messy purple wig that looked completely out of place in the morning light. Soon, the man began to move toward the players. He didn't say a word, but he started following a group of people as they tried to move to a different part of the park. Every time they turned left, he turned left, if they moved right, he moved right, mirroring their steps like a shadow. The group felt trapped, as if they were being hunted in broad daylight. One man in the group finally grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice shaking as he told the operator, "I don't know what his deal is, but he's following me, he won't let us leave." The caller told the police that the man was staring at them and acting as if he was about to pull something out of his clothes. The fear in the park was growing by the second. People who had just wanted a quiet game were now huddled together, watching the man in the purple wig and wondering what he was going to do next. They were cornered in a corner of the park, desperately waiting for a siren to break the silence and end the terrifying standoff. Dispatchers quickly sent out a call for the nearest officer, and Terry McGuffey, known in our story as Julian Merrick, responded that he was on his way. The group of pickleball players felt the world shrinking around them as the man in the purple wig kept closing the distance. Every time they tried to walk away toward a more crowded area, he would speed up his pace to block their path. It wasn't just that he was following them, he was hunting them, moving with a strange, mechanical precision that made it impossible to shake him off. They were eventually pushed into a corner of the park near a fence, with no easy way to get past him without getting too close. "Cops are coming, dude. Get back," the caller shouted, hoping the threat of the police would make the man back away. But the man in the red hoodie didn't seem to care about the police. He just stood there, staring with wide, unblinking eyes, mirroring every move the group made. If they stepped to the left, he stepped to the left. If they tried to edge to the right, he was already there, cutting off their escape. The terror was thick in the air because they couldn't understand what he wanted or why he had chosen them. The callers described the situation as being cornered in a corner, a desperate place where they felt completely helpless. Just as the man began to run directly toward them, the sound of a distant siren finally reached the park. The group saw a police cruiser pulling up, and the relief was instant. They watched as Officer Julian Merrick stepped out of his car and began walking toward the man in the purple wig. For the players, the nightmare was over, but for the officer, it was just beginning. Officer Julian Merrick walked toward the man in the purple wig with a calm but careful pace. He didn't draw his weapon, instead, he used his voice to try and understand what was happening. The man, who identified himself as Brandon Claiborne, stood near the pickleball courts, looking slightly confused but not immediately aggressive. Merrick noticed the bright red hoodie and the strange hair that the callers had described so clearly. The officer's goal was to figure out if this was a simple case of someone having a bad day or something much more dangerous. As Merrick got closer, he began asking basic questions to see how the man would react. He asked for the man's name and why he was spending his morning at the park. Claiborne's answers were strange and sometimes hard to follow. He mentioned being punked out and complained that people were laughing at him. Despite the odd behavior, the conversation seemed cordial at first, like a normal talk between a citizen and the police. Merrick remained professional, even as Claiborne took slow sips of water and avoided looking him directly in the eye. While they talked, the people who had called 911 finally saw their chance to escape. They hurried away in the background, thankful that a professional was now handling the situation. Merrick felt he was making progress, unaware that the calm demeanor of the man in front of him was just a mask. He continued to ask about Claiborne's health and if he was taking any medication, trying to piece together the suspect's mental state before deciding what to do next. Even though the situation felt strange, Brandon Claiborne acted very calm as he spoke with Officer Merrick. He stood there in his bright purple wig, taking slow sips from a bottle of water, and answered questions in a way that made him seem harmless. Merrick kept his voice friendly and professional, trying to keep the mood light so that things wouldn't get tense. At this point, it looked like a simple conversation that would end with the man moving along or being taken in for a minor mental health check. Behind this calm mask, however, things were starting to feel off. When Merrick asked Claiborne if he was on any medication, the man gave a confusing answer about not being given an American name. Despite the weird answers, Claiborne didn't yell or try to run away. He just stood his ground, acting like he had every right to be there, even after being told that people were scared of him. Merrick remained patient, unaware that this quiet behavior was just a way for Claiborne to keep the officer close without raising any alarms. The mask stayed on even when the topic turned to the reports of him exposing himself. Claiborne didn't get angry or defensive. Instead, he casually admitted to the behavior, saying he did it simply because he felt like it. This honesty was chilling, but because he stayed so still and quiet, Merrick didn't realize that the man in the red hoodie was actually waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The officer told him to stay put, thinking he still had control of the situation, while the suspect was secretly preparing to turn the peaceful park into a battlefield. The conversation took a dark and honest turn when Officer Merrick asked about the reports of indecent exposure. Instead of making excuses or acting ashamed, Drum admitted to everything with a chilling lack of emotion. When asked why he would do something like that in a public park, his answer was simple and terrifying: "I did it 'cause I felt like it." There was no deeper reason or sign of regret, he simply followed his own dark urges. Merrick realized then that he wasn't dealing with someone who was just confused or lost. He was dealing with someone who felt he was above the rules and didn't care who he hurt or scared. Despite this admission, Cuz remained physically still, continuing to act as if they were just having a casual chat. Merrick told him to stay exactly where he was, planning to take him into custody safely. He thought the man's honesty meant he was giving up, but in reality, Cuz was just being honest about his lack of self-control. The park was quiet, and for a few seconds, it seemed like the arrest would be easy. Merrick reached for his handcuffs, believing the cordial mask was still in place. He didn't know that by admitting he did whatever he felt like, Cuz was actually issuing a warning. The suspect wasn't going to follow orders, he was going to follow his next violent impulse, and that impulse was about to explode into a fight for survival. Everything changed in a heartbeat. 1 second, Officer Merrick was standing calmly, and the next, the air was filled with violence. As Merrick moved closer to secure the suspect, Drum didn't run away. Instead, he lunged forward with a speed that caught the officer completely off guard. The quiet park was suddenly filled with the sounds of a desperate struggle as the two men crashed into the grass. Cuz wasn't just trying to get away, he was attacking with a wild, terrifying energy. Merrick tried to use his training to hold the man down, but Cuz was fighting like someone who had nothing to lose. In the chaos of the tumble, Merrick's hands were busy trying to defend his face and neck, making it impossible for him to reach for his tools. He couldn't get to his handcuffs, and even worse, he couldn't reach the radio on his shoulder to call for help. The explosion of movement was so fast that Merrick didn't realize at first what had happened. During the scramble on the ground, Cuz's hands were moving everywhere, grabbing at Merrick's belt. Before the officer could reset his position, he felt a weight leave his side. Cuz had managed to rip the taser right out of its holster. Now, the suspect wasn't just stronger and faster, he was armed with the officer's own weapon, and the fight for survival had just reached a deadly new level. The situation turned from a struggle into a nightmare when Officer Merrick felt his belt grow light. In the middle of the chaotic tumble on the grass, Cuz Drum's hands had found exactly what they were looking for. With a sharp yank, the suspect ripped the taser right out of its holster. Merrick realized with a jolt of terror that he was no longer just fighting a man, he was fighting a man who now held a weapon designed to paralyze the human body. Merrick tried to scramble away, but he was trapped under the suspect's weight. He watched in horror as Cuz held the taser up, the bright red light of the laser sight dancing across the grass and the officer's own uniform. The officer's training told him he needed to create distance, but Cuz was relentless, staying on top of him and using his knees to pin Merrick's arms down. The power had shifted completely, and Merrick was left defenseless, unable to reach his gun or his radio to tell anyone that he was being overpowered. Then, the air was filled with the sharp, crackling sound of electricity. Cuz didn't just hold the weapon to scare the officer, he began using it as a club, swinging the heavy device into the back of Merrick's head over and over again. Each blow felt like an explosion, making Merrick's vision go blurry and dark. The officer was being beaten with his own equipment, and as the strength started to leave his body, he realized that he was completely at the mercy of a man who had no intention of stopping. The fight became a blur of pain and panic as Officer Merrick felt Cuz Drum's weight pressing him into the dirt. With the taser being used as a blunt object to strike his head, Merrick's world began to spin. But the most terrifying moment was yet to come. As Merrick tried to shield his face, he felt Drum's hands move away from the weapon and toward his eyes. Drum wasn't just trying to beat the officer anymore, he was trying to take away his sight forever. Merrick felt the suspect's fingers pressing hard into his eye sockets, a sensation of pressure and sharp pain that made him scream out in agony. "I knew I had to get his hand out of my eye," Merrick later recalled, describing the desperate battle to pull the suspect's fingers away while being pinned down. Every time he managed to move a hand, another blow from the taser or a fist would land, making his vision flicker like a dying light bulb. Merrick was blinded by his own blood and the swelling in his face. He could no longer see the park, the sky, or his attacker, he could only feel the relentless digging and clawing at his eyes. He was trapped in a dark, private world of violence, using every ounce of his remaining strength to keep his eyelids closed against the assault. It was a primitive struggle for one of his most precious senses, and as the seconds ticked by, Merrick realized he was losing the strength to keep fighting back. As the assault continued, Officer Merrick felt his strength fading. He was pinned to the ground, blinded by blood and the swelling of his eyes, and every time he tried to move, another heavy blow from the taser or a fist landed on his head. The suspect, Cuz Drum, was relentless, striking the officer somewhere between 30 and 39 times. Merrick realized that he couldn't reach his gun, his radio was useless, and his vision was gone. In that dark moment, a terrifying thought filled his mind: "I'm done. I'm going to die right here in the grass." He felt completely alone, even though he was in a public park in the middle of the morning. With no way to fight back anymore, Merrick made a final, desperate choice to survive. He pulled his knees up and tucked his chin, moving into a fetal position to protect his neck and the back of his head as best as he could. He stopped trying to arrest Cuz and focused entirely on staying alive for just one more second. Every hit felt like it might be the last thing he ever felt. He lay there in the dirt, covered his head with his arms, and waited, hoping that anyone would hear the silent prayer of a man who had run out of options. While Officer Merrick was fighting for his life, his backup was desperately trying to reach him. Officer Hageman had received the call at the same time, but there was a major problem. He was patrolling the area on a Segway, a two-wheeled motorized device that is much slower than a police car. As the minutes ticked by, Hageman pushed the machine to its top speed, but he couldn't move fast enough to close the distance. He knew something was wrong when the radio went quiet and a butterfly feeling began to grow in his stomach. Every second counted, but the path to the pickleball courts was not a straight line for the Segway. Hageman had to navigate through park traffic and around obstacles, all while knowing that his partner was alone with a potentially dangerous suspect. The delay was agonizing. By the time he finally saw Merrick's police cruiser in the distance, several minutes had already passed since the struggle began. As he got closer, Hageman saw a sight that he would never forget. He saw the suspect, Brandon Claiborne, standing over Merrick, who was curled up on the ground in a fetal position and bleeding heavily from his head. The suspect still had the stolen taser in his hand, ready to strike again. Hageman jumped off his Segway before it even came to a full stop, knowing that if he had been just a few seconds later, his partner might not have survived the attack. Officer Hageman didn't waste a single second once he reached the scene. He jumped off his Segway and ran toward the two men in the grass, his voice booming with authority. "Get on the ground. Get on the ground right now," he shouted, pointedly directing his command at the man in the purple wig. Casper Kuzdrum looked up, surprised by the sudden arrival of another officer, but he still held the stolen taser tightly in his hand. Hageman moved in quickly, not giving Kuz any time to think or react. He used his training to force the suspect away from his injured partner and onto the dirt. "Put your hands behind your back. Do it now," Hageman ordered as he wrestled the taser away from Kuz and secured his hands in metal cuffs. The threat was finally over, and the suspect who had caused so much terror was now face down in the grass, no longer able to hurt anyone. As soon as the suspect was locked in the back of a police car, Hageman turned all his attention to Julian Merrick. He was shocked by what he saw. Merrick was bleeding heavily from his head and his face was so swollen he could barely move. Hageman grabbed his radio to call for an ambulance immediately, his voice filled with urgency. 6119, expediting an ambulance to my location, he called out, knowing that every minute mattered for his partner's recovery. Merrick was still conscious, but he was in a state of shock. He tried to tell Hageman what had happened, his voice weak and shaky. "I couldn't get to my gun, he tried to tear my eyes out," he whispered. Hageman stayed by his side, telling him to stay still and that help was on the way. The rescue had been successful, but as Hageman looked at his friend's injuries, he knew the battle for Merrick's health was just beginning. The ambulance arrived quickly, its sirens cutting through the morning air. Officer Hageman stayed right next to his partner, trying to keep him calm while they waited for the paramedics to take over. Julian Merrick was bleeding a lot from wounds on the back of his head. To help, Hageman took off his own shirt and pressed it against the cuts to try and stop the blood. Merrick was awake and talking, but he was very confused and in a lot of pain. When the paramedics got to him, they started checking his injuries right away. One medic looked at Merrick's head and noticed it was split open and looked out of shape. Merrick kept saying, "He just kept hitting me," as they worked to clean the blood off his face. The medics asked if he knew who he was and where he was to make sure his brain was okay. Merrick answered, "Yes, sir," showing that he was still conscious despite the heavy beating. The most worrying part was Merrick's eyes. The medics tried to get him to open them so they could check for permanent damage. "Are you able to open your eyes?" a paramedic asked. Merrick tried, but he whispered, "I can't." Both of his eyes were swollen completely shut from the suspect trying to gouge them out. As they loaded him into the back of the ambulance, the team knew they had to get him to the hospital fast to save his sight. After the chaos at the park, Casper Kuzdrum was taken to a small, cold room at the police station. Two men, Detective McNeil and Detective Tuss, sat across from him to figure out why a quiet morning had turned into a bloodbath. Drum sat in his chair, still appearing strange and out of touch with reality. He had already been read his rights and agreed to talk about what happened. The detectives started by asking about the fight at the park. Drum told them that he had been chasing people because he felt like they were trying to flex on him. He didn't seem to care that he had hurt someone. Instead, he spoke calmly about the violence, as if it were a normal thing to do. He even admitted that the very first thing he did was go for the officer's eyes. As the detectives listened, they realized that talking to Drum would be a huge challenge. His answers were often disjointed, and he seemed to be living in a different world. However, they needed to know the truth about the weapon. Drum admitted that he took the taser because he actually thought it was the officer's gun. He told the detectives that he pulled the trigger over and over again because he was hoping to kill the officer. Inside the interrogation room, the air felt heavy as Detective McNeil leaned forward. He had heard many stories in his career, but he wasn't prepared for what Casper Kuzdrum was about to say. The detective asked a simple question, "Why? Why did you hope to kill him?" Drum didn't hesitate. He didn't look sad or ashamed. He looked the detective in the eye and said, "Because he's white." The room went quiet as the weight of those words sank in. Drum explained that because he was black and the officer was white, he felt the attack was justified. He believed that the color of Officer Merrick's skin was a good enough reason to try and take his life and his sight. The detectives were stunned by how calmly Drum admitted to a hate crime. He spoke about it as if it were a simple fact, like the weather or the time of day. There was no sign that he understood how wrong his actions were. For Officer Merrick, the physical pain was already a heavy burden, but the realization that he was targeted solely because of his race added a new layer of trauma to the story. The motive was finally clear, and it was a chilling reminder of how much hate and confusion were living inside the man in the purple wig. As the case moved toward the courtroom, the focus shifted to Brandon Claiborne's mental health. It was revealed that he suffered from schizophrenia, a serious brain disorder that can make it hard to tell what is real and what is not. His lawyers argued that he wasn't fully in control of his actions on that July morning. They pointed to his strange behavior, like wearing the purple wig and his disjointed answers during the interrogation, as proof that his mind was broken. However, the detectives and prosecutors looked at the evidence differently. They remembered how Claiborne admitted he had chased the people at the park because he felt like it. They also focused on his cold confession that he tried to kill the officer specifically because of his race. Even with his illness, Claiborne seemed to know exactly what he was doing when he reached for the officer's eyes and pulled the trigger on the taser. The big question for the court was whether being sick was an excuse for such a targeted and violent attack. Claiborne himself didn't seem to think he belonged in a hospital or a jail. When asked what he thought his punishment should be, he simply said he wanted to go to his dad's house. He truly believed he could just walk away from the damage he had caused. The schizophrenia defense became a battle between understanding a mental illness and making sure a violent offender was held responsible for a hateful act. The courtroom was quiet as the judge prepared to deliver the final word on the case of Casper Cuz Drum. The evidence was overwhelming: the 911 calls, the body camera footage of the brutal struggle, and Drum's own cold confession that he targeted Officer Merrick because of his race. While the defense pointed to his struggles with schizophrenia, the prosecution argued that his actions were calculated, persistent, and fueled by a specific intent to kill and maim. The judge looked at the photos of Officer Merrick's injuries, the deep lacerations to his head and the severe trauma to his eyes, and then at Drum, who sat motionless. The court found that regardless of his mental state, Drum posed a profound danger to the public. For the charges of felonious assault on a peace officer and the specifications regarding the hate-motivated nature of the attack, the hammer finally came down. Casper Drum was sentenced to a minimum of 10 to 15 years in prison, followed by a lifetime of supervision if he were ever to be released. For the community at Sawyer Point, it was a moment of closure. For the police department, it was a somber reminder of how quickly a routine call can turn into a fight for survival. But for one man, the story wasn't about the sentence, it was about the long road back to the light.